Welcome to session 3. We're going to talk about human sexuality, the truth about sex from God's Word. You know, this might be a bit sensitive, but I want you to lean back, want you to relax and realize that though we're bombarded in our world about sex, most Christians don't know what God's Word says. We're going to look very specifically and learn not only the shift in the culture, but the shift in the church about sex. We're going to look at 7 specific myths about sexuality. And you know what? You're going to be real surprised by what God's Word says about sex. Let's go for it. Never in the history of the world has a culture and its values shifted concerning sexuality as fast or as drastically as America in the last 40 to 50 years. I'm not saying, and this author, historian is not saying that there hasn't been morality far worse or equivalent to America, but never in the history of this planet has a view of sexuality moved as fast and as far in a short amount of time. I'm going to ask you to open your teaching notes, if you will, and I want to chronicle the shift. And we're going to talk today about sex, the search for truth about human sexuality. What's really true? Here's the shift. In the late 1940s, 1950, about 5% of girls in high school and about 10% of boys in high school were sexually active. Fast forward 50 to 60 years, 70% of girls, 80% of boys are sexually active in high school. Today, 50% of all women under 30 cohabitate, live with someone prior to marriage. The divorce rate in the late 40s, decade of the 50s, single digits. The divorce rate today, over 50%. In fact, the problem, by the way, don't get this, that there's these terrible things that have happened out there. This is in the church. 1969, we entered into no-fault divorce. Morality had been changing. Doesn't matter why. By 1996, evangelical Christians' divorce rate was 4% higher than the national average. And in the Bible Belt, it was 50% higher than the national average. I'm talking about the shift inside of sexuality and family in the church. I read an interesting statistic. 1987, 75 million people bought a rental of a XXX porn. 1987. 1992, 490 million rentals of XXX porn. By 1996, 665 million rentals. U.S. News has said the distributor of porn in all the world has its heart here in America. We distribute more than anyone else. Back then, it was 150 new XXX porn videos per week, new titles. Once the internet exploded, they don't even count rentals anymore. About 40% of most men in America visit a porn site regularly. And the percentage of women is increasing rapidly. I just had a little conversation between a friend after the service who has a good friend who's a sexual therapist, and she said, you know, for the first 25 years, I had no women in my sexual therapy, and now 30% of all the people that I see for sexual addictions are women. My point, very simple. Shift. Huge shift. In fact, in the church, I read an article, World Magazine. Some of you may take it, an interesting article, and it was an article about a panel at a conference, a Bible conference, and a professor from a college was there talking to people about sexuality, and the quote goes something like this. She's a professor from an evangelical school, and she said, it's fine in church to stand up and talk about God's ideal for sexuality and marriage and all the rest, but the fact of the matter is, we know people in their 20s and early 30s are not going to be sexually celibate. So at the church, what we need to do is say, yes, there is an ideal, but we need to provide contraceptives in Bible churches, so when people disobey, the damage will be a little bit less. Now think of that. In other words, the Spirit of God living in Christians now doesn't have the power for us to obey God. So let's violate one command so maybe we won't mess up on another one. All I want you to get is, you are living in a day where the speed and the change of sexual moral standards have moved like never before. Notice in your notes the cause. Well, the shift in truth, the search for freedom in the 60s and the 70s, the bad teaching in the church. We've done a terrible job. I mean, how many people growing up, well, don't raise your hand, but at least for me, before I opted out of church, I never heard a message on sex. Most people don't hear a message on sex. In fact, some of our heroes of the faith, Calvin and Martin Luther and others, I mean, they had a very warped view. They did a lot of things well. They had a pretty warped view about sex.